You know, we've been talking about Vietnam, of course, all morning long about their manufacturing resurgence. We wanted to play just one slice of life cultural story that involves the Sofitel Metropole Hotel here in Hanoi. It's the oldest hotel in the city. It's been around since the early 1900s, well before the Vietnam War. During a renovation about 8 years ago, though, they found a very haunting discovery. Down these stairs, under about 2 meters of concrete and sand, is a bomb shelter that was built for guests to escape from air raids during the Vietnam War, or as the Vietnamese call it, the American War. It had multiple chambers and multiple doors, all made of iron, obviously very low ceilings, equipped with electricity, lighting fixtures, and ventilation. Pulled this open and air was able to come in for about 40 guests to be in here for about half an hour as they waited for the U.S. planes to finish their bombing raids overhead. It's obviously an incredible scene and an incredible feeling. Imagine being in here, not knowing what you were going to find when you went back upstairs. But despite all of this, the Vietnamese continue to have a very warm view of the United States. And that's one reason this trade relationship between the U.S. and Vietnam continues to be so important. Morgan and John, if you guys ever find yourself in Hanoi, it's quite an experience to go down there. It does sort of bring to mind the mindset of the Vietnamese worker. John, I don't know if, Morgan, maybe you've been to China and checked out the Guangdong province where so much high-tech manufacturing is, but you're dealing with a population of 100 million people who go back and forth between the countryside and the city. They call it the biggest mobile workforce in the world. And the question for Vietnam will be whether or not they can recreate that somehow and train them in ways we've been talking about all hour.
Now, Carl, you said that hotel was renovated 8 years ago, but that shot of outside it made me question just how much it was renovated, and also raised the question, if Vietnam wants more of this international business, more manufacturing, what are the conditions, like the accommodations for business travel?
For business travel, right. I mean, you're talking about, it's not just, you know, we talk so much about manufacturing, and it is the assembly workers who are on the production line, but there's also mid-level managers who have to live there, in many cases with their families. So you got multiple levels of retention practices that will have to take place. Will there be services? Are there coffee shops and schools that'll let these executives continue to work and operate between manufacturing hubs? Again, this is just an example of how complicated it is. We have this notion on TV like, oh, well, just move your supply chains out of China, find a new vendor and get going. It doesn't work like that. And the only way you can figure that out is by actually coming to places like this and talking to people on the ground.
In terms of a mobile workforce, I mean, you use the example of China, Carl. Would the fact that you are seeing so much growth in Vietnam right now and this demand, is it going to change immigration policies, or has it already helped shape immigration policies in that country in terms of being able to bring more workers and maybe more skilled workers in?
Yeah, that's a good question, because right now they really, with 95 million people, they have to take it from some other part of the economy. Would they be able to retrain people from the rural areas? Would people give up their farms to move to the cities? I mean, that's what we saw in China 20 years ago. Well, people from Western China came to the coasts and learned how to work on manufacturing lines. But those are big mysteries when it comes to Vietnam, and that's why, even though we're here, we're trying to give a picture of where things stand right now. There are a ton of unanswered questions. We know money's flowing in. We know commitments have been made. We know some of the giants are on the ground. But those longer, less visible curves behind those corners are much harder to see. You're right.
I know it's late, Carl. You've been working hard, so hate to throw you a curveball, but any surprises? I know what you expected perhaps to find when you went out there to report, but what, if anything, has caught you off guard and stuck with you?
It's a good question. I mean, I think there's the conversation about TPP. Would Vietnam's chances have been better had the U.S. not pulled out? Would Vietnam, in the end, be more competitive as a signatory to that deal with the U.S.? That's a big question. I also was, I think interested to learn about the way the Vietnamese see the Chinese as perhaps their biggest external security threat. They're very wary of the Chinese, maybe as wary as the United States is, because of their history of occupation, their just general unfavorable feeling about what the Chinese are up to. So even though they're taking in all this capital, they're still very cautious about who it's coming from and what the Chinese motives are for investing in this country. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, Carl, that's such a key point. I wonder how the Trump administration, whether there have been any comments or sense of sentiment from the Trump administration about this idea that you have some manufacturing, some of the supply chain shifting from China to Vietnam, and in the midst of that relationship.
Yeah, this came up on Squawk Box this morning. We have a trade imbalance with Vietnam, and the president really hasn't mentioned that because he's been focused on trade imbalances in other countries like China. But if Vietnam really got the pedal to the metal on all of this and that imbalance got even bigger, would our targets turn on Vietnam as well? We just don't know. That's sort of the weird new world we're in when it comes to international trade and the way the U.S. is playing this trade game. We heard comments from Navarro today, the U.S. trade rep, about the EU. They say they want a rock-solid relationship, and that's probably true. But if this administration's proving anything, it's that they are unpredictable and they do turn on corners. And I'm sure the Vietnamese are taking stock of that as well.